What's up world? It's Willy What If here with another new video for you. This is part 2 of What If Deku Was a Doctor? Ochako finally has Deku's number, but will she have the courage to capaitalize? Or maybe Mina will lend a helping hand? Only one way to find out. Part 2. Ochako decided not to tell the others about Izuku, and she asked Mina not to say anything just before the others arrived. It was too complicated to get into with everyone, especially on their Dungeons and Dragons night. But it was nearly a moot point anyway when Momo told them about a little girl in her class getting burned and how 2 paramedics had been called to take her to the hospital. Ochako felt heat prickle on the back of her neck while Mina threw her a pointed, totally unsubtle look. Sue glanced over at them both and placed a curious fingertip to her chin, but she didn't say anything, and nobody else seemed to notice. Regardless of who the paramedics were, Momo didn't describe them, so there was no way of knowing if it was Izuku or not. She'd clearly been very shaken up, and the group all offered their sympathy for her. She hadn't been a qualified teacher for very long, but Ochako couldn't believe how someone so grounded and mature was always so unsure of herself and her abilities. She always looked so anxious to be responsible for the children in her class, as if she was always second-guessing her own qualification and natural affinity for teaching. A child getting injured while in her care was something that would play on her mind for a long time. Worry had clouded her expression and her voice, even when she was smiling and explaining that the student was fine in the end and wouldn't scar. They'd all sighed in relief and offered Momo words of support, which did seem to brighten her eyes a little. The rest of the night passed in a blur of dice rolling, laughing and eating snacks, which always happened when the group got together. Considering Sue was so sensible in real life, she always came up with the most fantastical situations. Ochako treasured those happy times, thankful that her move into the city had also given her the opportunity to discover a good group of friends. The others had all known each other from high school or even earlier, so Ochako was the most recent addition, but they never made her feel like it. They'd all accepted her into their group as one of their own, as if she'd always belonged there. She would always be grateful to them. But for once she was actually kind of relieved when they finally went home, as it gave her an opportunity to text Izuku. She hoped he wasn't disappointed that she hadn't sent him anything straight away. She'd specifically wanted to send a message after her friends had gone, because it meant that she wouldn't have divided attentions during their night, or any awkward questions about who she was talking to. And it gave her time to think of what she could say to him. Mina hadn't meant to make things awkward between them, but Ochako could feel her face heat up by just thinking of what he'd overheard. She watched the cursor blink on her phone's message screen, thinking of a dozen different things she could send. Her thumbs didn't move. She rolled onto her back on the sofa and clutched her phone to her chest with a groan. It was getting late now, and Ochako realized he could even be in bed already. Maybe it would be better to just send him a message tomorrow instead. But if she put it off for too long, she could end up with it being too awkward to send him one at all, and then they might never speak again. Ochako stopped her racing thoughts and tried to remind herself that putting off sending messages had never worked out for her in the past and that she should just do it. She sucked in a deep breath as she sat upright, crossed her legs on the sofa cushions, and let her thumbs dance across the screen. "Hello, it's Ochako. Thank you for the number, here is mine." She barely punched in the full stop before she slammed a thumb on the backspace. Way too formal. "Hi. It's Ochako. Here's my number. Thanks for yours. Text me anytime. Hope this doesn't wake you up." She tapped the backspace again with growing frustration. "No way. Too enthusiastic. Hi Deku, it's Ochako. Smile. Thanks for a really nice evening earlier." Her thumb stopped mid-sentence, hovering uncertainly above the screen, wondering if she should mention Mina and what she'd said. Should apologize? Things had gotten awkward. Her friend had practically inadvertently admitted that she'd got something like a crush on him. Wait, had she got a crush on him? Ochako thought of all the fluttery, happy feelings that warmed her chest whenever she was around Izuku, and the nervous beating of her heart when she thought of him. She'd been almost fixated on his opinion of her and so full of anticipation and excitement at just the thought of seeing him again. Oh gods, maybe it really was a crush. Ochako fell back onto her sofa and hid her face in her hands while she let out a high-pitched squeak. She had a crush on her neighbor that lived in the room right below hers. The same neighbor who inadvertently woke her up at 5 o'clock every morning. The neighbor who jogged to work every day, saved lives, and whose smile could put butterflies in her stomach. The neighbor that had given her a piggyback, let her into his superhero-themed apartment, and put a bag of frozen peas on her ankle. She had a crush on him, but there was no way he'd have a crush on her. She was just a girl from a small town living in the city, working as a barista in a space-themed coffee shop, wearing a pretend space suit, hoping to make her parents proud one day. Ochako let out a long sigh. She really needed to get over herself before she got hurt. The fact that he still wanted to be friends with her after what happened was a miracle, and she needed to enjoy it for what it was, even if ultimately she had to push her own feelings down. With renewed energy, Ochako pushed herself back up and finished her message. Hi Deku, it's Ochako. Smile. Thanks for a really nice evening earlier. Sorry about Mina. She likes to exaggerate. Hope she didn't make you feel uncomfortable. She felt really bad. She thought she was being funny. Hopefully we'll bump into each other sometime. Also, I really hope this doesn't wake you up. Greater than. She tapped the send button before she could think about it, relief singing through her bones and butterflies still churning in her stomach. Done. She really did hope that he didn't get woken up by her message. Ochako stretched her arms up in the air and placed her phone on her coffee table, feeling somewhat emotionally drained from the last few hours, and wondered if she should try to get an early night for once too, when her phone vibrated. She hadn't been expecting a reply, so the buzz made her jump slightly and she jolted forwards to grab her phone, nearly dropping it on the carpet in her haste. It was from Izuku. Hey, I've got your number saved now, thanks. And don't worry about it. She seems nice. Smile. I just got shy and that's why I ran off so fast without really saying bye, sorry. So they weren't really going to address what Mina had said. That was fine. She could live perfectly well with never thinking about it again. Another message popped up. And it's okay. You didn't wake me up. I'm not really feeling sleepy tonight. Keep thinking about that great stew. Was a really nice evening. Hope we bump into each other too. Not literally though, otherwise I'd have to start keeping in a stock of frozen peas for twisted ankles. Ochako laughed aloud at her phone and felt a blush creeping up her neck. He seemed so much more confident in his texts. The butterflies in her stomach were responding accordingly, and she felt her heart quicken as she typed out a reply, her fingers skimming the screen with speed so that she could send her message without overthinking it or backing out. Was this flirting? Was she flirting? She didn't know, and she knew she wasn't supposed to be after she'd just decided to be friends, but she couldn't make herself stop. Lucky for you, I heard that they're making the frozen pea pack a new addition to the standard equipment a paramedic has to carry around with them. You were ahead of the trend. You can say you did it first. Oh, this might have seemed so tame to anyone else, but she'd never sent messages like that to anyone. Teasing. Flirting? Unable to take the wait for a reply, Ochako stood up and began pacing around her apartment, gripping her phone tightly as if she might miss the vibration. Did he think that was too far? She should have just replied with a laughing emoji or something generic like that. The phone finally buzzed, and she unlocked it immediately, feeling a rush of affection and laughter at the small reply. Frozen pea hipster? Greater than was all it said. Frozen pea hipster, she replied simply, smiling fondly at her screen. There was a little bit of a wait before the next message buzzed. I still can't believe I didn't have a single ice pack in my apartment. That's really not like me? Greater than. I'm telling ya, frozen peas are the future. Well, if it got rolled out, then everyone would need to know the story about how it became a medical discovery? No. I'd make you swear never to tell a soul about my pajamas and sandals. You wouldn't tell the whole medical field about the most embarrassing moments of my life, would you? And greater than. No. I was only joking. Actually, they probably wouldn't let me back in an ambulance if they knew I'd nearly knocked out a sleepwalker with my front door. Your secret is safe with me. Ochako paused at that and finally sank back down on her sofa. So, he thought she'd been sleepwalking. That must be the explanation he'd come up with for her appearance outside his door that early in the morning, looking like she just got out of bed. It made sense in a way, though she wondered if anyone who had been sleepwalking had ever successfully made it down a whole flight of stairs in an apartment building and still been asleep. Her phone buzzed again. Still sorry about your ankle. Should she go along with it? Or was this her chance to correct him and get the alarm sorted out? Over text it wouldn't be quite so bad, right? Maybe he'd take it better, and she wouldn't have to try and function on such an extreme lack of sleep all the time. But she knew he'd be devastated about it. He was still apologizing for her ankle. He seemed like the type of person to take blame and guilt straight onto his own shoulders, whether it made sense to or not. Lol, no probs. Seriously, it's a-okay, don't be sorry. Well, I know a really good sleep therapist if you want her number. Could help with the sleepwalking? Greater than. It's fine. I'm fine. Not a problem. But talking about sleep made me look at the time, and shouldn't you be doing that right now? You get up super early, right? Go to sleep. Greater than. You've got work in the morning. But I'm still full on good stew. Greater than. Ochako pressed send after each statement to make the messages stand out more, her heartbeat increasing with each message. Here's a deal. We can go get the ingredients next time we've got an evening off together. I can make it again for us? But only if you go to bed and get some rest. He replied almost instantly. Wow, really? Maybe we can cook it together and you can show me how you make it? It would keep us eating something healthy once in a while? Greater than. Ochako's pulse was racing and she didn't really know what to do with herself. She got up and paced again as she reread his message, her smile almost hurting her cheeks. He wanted to spend more time with her? I'd love to. Now sleep. Okay. Good night, Ochako X. She placed her phone on the kitchen counter and flapped her hands excitedly, a high-pitched squeak escaping her throat while she did, as if she had no idea how to express the warm and fuzzy feeling spreading through her body. The butterflies in her stomach had long since migrated to her chest. Did he mean for there to be a kiss at the end of his message? People put kisses at the end of their messages all the time, she reminded herself. It's not like it meant anything. It was like an end to the conversation, she was sure. Like an X-shaped full stop. It didn't mean anything more than that. Did it? It's not like it was an actual kiss. She only ever really texted her parents and her friends and they used kisses all the time in their conversations. She needed to calm down. He was just so much more confident through written words that it had really thrown her off. She could still hear his voice in her head while she read his messages, but it was almost as if that voice was much bolder than the stuttering and awkwardness that he portrayed in real life. Maybe that was the kind of self-assurance he used while he was at work, a sort of natural confidence that he held deep inside himself that came out when there were no social cues to contend with. With a little start, Ochako suddenly realized she hadn't replied yet, so she grabbed the phone and quickly typed out a small message, pressed send, slammed the phone back to the counter and covered her face with her hands. Good night, Deku X. Ochako woke to the sound of a song softly breaking through her sleep. She tapped her phone screen lightly, turning off her own alarm, and peeked at the display that read 4:30 and APAS. Despite the early hour, Ochako was too excited to feel tired and threw her off her quilt with more energy than she'd ever had this early in her life. She'd gone to bed herself just after finishing her conversation with Izuku, already deciding she was going to get up even earlier than him and surprise him by being already at the gym when he got there. She'd been intending on taking the gym back up anyway at some point, and she was already up at 5 every morning anyway, so she was going to meet him there this time and ask if she could tag along with him during the week. She might as well start doing something productive with her early mornings if she really wasn't going to tell him about his alarm. It did mean she would finally have to get more disciplined with herself on going to bed though, but figured it would be easier if she had Izuku to use as a good example. Or be a good example for, she thought ironically, since she was the one telling him to go to sleep the night before. Her old gym kit bag was stuffed down the back of her wardrobe, but she managed to yank it out and shake it back into something resembling its original shape. She was rapidly running out of time if she wanted to beat Izuku there, and she still had something else to do first. Ochako shoved some shower bits and pieces in the bag and quickly pulled on her old workout clothes. Her bed could be made when she got back. Despite her surprising amount of energy, equal parts excitement and having had a decent night of sleep, Ochako could feel her eyes stinging and rubbed them with her palms as she shuffled into her kitchen. She grabbed some bread from her cupboard, realizing she'd have to get a new loaf out of her freezer again soon, and laid 4 slices out of her 2 pieces of tin foil. She often made sandwiches for herself that she could take to work, so that she didn't have to spend as much money on convenience foods and overpriced sandwiches from the city center, so today she was going to make Izuku one too. There was something very domestic about making sandwiches for them both. Not exactly nutritious, she thought with a good-natured huff, buttering white bread and laying out slices of cheese in it, but satisfying and quick. He could even eat it inside the ambulance between patients. She hoped he liked cheese. Who didn't like cheese? Ochako wrapped the sandwiches in their foil and stuffed his inside her kit bag, while hers went into the fridge to take to work later. She knew she'd be suffering by the end of the day by going to the gym before her shift, but she'd build up her strength and it would get easier every day. It was funny how just a couple of conversations with Izuku had prompted her life-changing epiphany. But she felt motivated to get herself out of the stagnation she'd been floating in with her life ever since she finished university and get out there and do something. She didn't have to change her life, but just do more with it. Let herself enjoy it. Find constellations and fairy lights. Ochako ran into her bedroom and quickly ran a brush through her hair before pulling it back into a small rough ponytail, then dashed out of her apartment. She smiled in determination as she jogged down the steps of the apartment building, checking her watch. His alarm would be going off now. She couldn't wait to see his expression when she was already there waiting for him. Ochako pushed out of the door to the apartment building and gasped at the early morning chill. Frost glittered across the city and made it look like something out of a dream. She pulled the zip on her jacket up around her chin and put her headphones in her ears securely, knowing she'd need to jog fast if she wanted to get there first now. Her heart galloped in her chest and she let out a little mischievous laugh that billowed out into the frozen air in front of her. She felt so alive. Her trainers thumping against the concrete was a steady beat as she jogged, falling back into the rhythm of the movement she used to do so often. There were barely any cars on the road, though she was surprised to see just how many delivery vans and lorries took advantage of the lack of traffic this early in the morning. Her eyes were still stinging, even more so in the cold air, and she was beginning to feel her limbs tire already. She knew they'd warm up if she kept going though, so she increased her pace and turned up the volume of her music to keep herself energized. She just needed to go a little faster or he'd catch her up before she even got there. Ochako felt herself smile widely when one of her favorite songs came on and she tapped the volume up further, rubbing her stinging eyes with her hands as she hopped down the curb into the road. She had to get there fast. He was going to be so surprised. Izuku dashed into his kitchen, tugged down the hem of his shirt, and gulped down the remainder of last night's cup of water, shuddering a little at the familiar stale taste. His alarm had woken him up, but he'd been so tired that he'd switched it off instead of hitting snooze and then fallen back to sleep. He was only 20 minutes behind schedule, but his morning routine relied on him fitting as much in as he could in a short amount of time. He'd just have to jog to the gym a little faster. He sighed as he tried to tie the laces up on his trainers but fumbled with the knot in his haste and had to start again. He really shouldn't have stayed up so late texting with Ochako, but just the memory of their exchanges brought a smile to his face. He had been so nervous about putting his number under her door, determined to do it even though he'd missed the opportunity when they were face to face, and then spent the next few hours trying not to constantly glance at his phone. He'd assumed that maybe she was too embarrassed about what her friend had said and didn't want anything to do with him anymore. Or she'd been offended by how fast he'd taken off from her apartment. The girl with pink hair, that had introduced herself as Mina, let slip that Ochako thought he was a good person, and that had made him so happy in a way he didn't fully understand. He had been told he was a good person many times by his patients, but it had never produced that kind of reaction from him before. Did he like her? Did she like him? He tried not to let his mind wander back to last night as he left his apartment, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. He had a bad habit of letting thoughts bounce around his head too much, so he'd been unable to sleep, even after he'd stopped texting Ochako with his promise of going to bed. His mind had been buzzing with the strange turn of events over the last couple of days. Izuku considered taking the lift down to the ground floor once he was in the corridor, but he figured he'd just take the stairs two at a time and it would be just as fast. By the time he pushed open the building's front doors and burst out into the frozen air, he was already hot from his jog down the stairs, so the chill hit him with force and made him shiver. He was only wearing a thin jacket, but he knew that running would warm him up quickly, so Izuku took a deep breath in and out, watched it swirl away, then set off. He went over the messages he'd sent her last night in his mind while he jogged. Even though he didn't really want to, he was worried that he had come across too forward. It was always difficult to read tone through text, so he tried hard to keep it light and playful, even though he had agonized over the exact specific phrasing of each message before he sent it. Izuku spent a lot of his free time blogging about the movies he watched, participating in forum discussions, and even writing his own fanfiction, but typing messages to the girl who lived upstairs had made him so nervous that he'd been wiping sweaty hands on his sleeping shorts between texts. The effect she had on him was so strange, he couldn't explain it. He could calm people down when they'd been in an accident, he could bandage bleeding wounds, pop a joint back into its socket, chat to lonely old people, make a worried child smile, but he blushed and stuttered around her like he'd never spoken to a girl before in his life. Which, admittedly, he'd not spoken to many girls. But even then, he could speak to them without feeling highly conscious of not only everything he did, but hyper-aware of everything she did too. The way her hair bobbed when she made motions with her head was so cute, her animated hand movements while she spoke made him smile, and her cheeks, that were always pink anyway, would bloom even brighter sometimes when they spoke. She had such pretty, kind, big brown eyes. When she looked at him, he just felt good somehow, like she was seeing him in a way nobody else ever had. Izuku ran a hand through his messy hair, his heartbeat racing not just from the jog. Maybe I do want to be more than just friends with her? Maybe friends just won't be enough for me. He blinked as he realized it. The warm feelings and the butterflies in his stomach when he spent time with her, especially when they had their almost a date last night, was because, oh, No wonder he'd impulsively asked her to spend more time with him. At least the best thing about texting was that he couldn't stutter. But it was easy to send something and regret it, which is why he also couldn't stop thinking about that ridiculous text kiss he'd sent her. Izuku could feel heat creeping up his neck and into his cheeks as he remembered his horror at seeing the text send with a kiss. He hadn't meant to type it, but he'd been sleepy and happy and it just kind of happened. As soon as he tapped the send button, he'd immediately noticed his mistake. He threw his phone away from himself and shoved his pillow over his head, burying himself under his bed quilt as if he could escape what he'd done. But it was too late. When his phone buzzed again, he'd spent a few minutes putting off the inevitable, until he couldn't take it anymore and rummaged on the floor for wherever he'd flung it. She replied with a kiss back. Izuku smiled widely into the fresh early morning air, nodding his head politely at a passing dog walker who shuffled along, bundled up in a thick winter coat. He was keeping up a good pace, so it wouldn't take him long to get to the gym at the rate he was going. He'd be able to make up the time he lost soon. Izuku stopped at the side of a road, jogging on the spot to stay warm, as a few delivery vans sped past. Many of the businesses and stores in the city relied upon early deliveries, but they usually just interrupted the momentum on his jogs. He checked his watch again and waited until there was a big enough gap to cross, leaping over the pool of ice that always formed in the gutters of the roads. There was something beautiful about all the ice and frost that glittered and shined before the sun rose, but he'd attended so many accident scenes where someone had slipped on ice, so he knew firsthand how dangerous the winter beauty could be. He only needed to go around the corner, cross the road, and he'd be there. He'd made great tea. Izuku slowed slightly as he rounded the corner and saw an ambulance across the road ahead of him. The crouched forms of two paramedics were easily identifiable by their bright green coats, practically shining in the gloom. He could just about see a lady in a purple tracksuit that was stood off to one side, clutching a fluffy dog to her chest. Izuku's eyebrows pulled together sharply, and he pushed forwards with speed. As he approached the scene, he recognized the two paramedics crouching over the patient on the floor. Shino's perfectly sculptured burgundy bob and Ryuko's bright blonde ponytail gave them away instantly. His boots thumped on the concrete as he got closer, which must have alerted them to his swift approach because Shino spoke over her shoulder in a voice full of authority. "Sorry, but can you please keep the area clear? This is an accident scene. And quad." He started. Ryuko looked up sharply. "Sir, you're going to have to Izuku." Her blue eyes widened. "What's happened?" And quad. Shino gave him a quick nod, but her attention remained focused on the patient, who was still hidden from Izuku's line of sight. "We're still assessing, but looks like head trauma. Can you hear me?" she added, raising her volume. "We need to immobilize your neck so that your spine stays still, okay? And quad. The patient didn't reply. Izuku knew he should stay a respectful distance away, so that he didn't get in their way while they worked, especially since he didn't have his uniform on, but he was physically unable to stop himself from moving forwards and seeing if there was something that he could do. "Can I help with?" "Oh. No. No. It can't be," he croaked. Izuku's whole body ran cold. No. It felt like the ground had opened beneath his feet, leaving his stomach and heart flipping over as he plunged down and down and down. He had never frozen at an accident scene before, but it felt like every limb had locked in place. His throat seemed to constrict, and he took in a deep, sharp breath, feeling like his chest was too tight to inhale enough breath to even speak. "Ochako," he whispered hoarsely. Ryuko gave him a questioning glance, but continued to help Shino with the equipment they would need. Ochako was lying in the frozen gutter of the road, eyes closed, with a wet scarlet patch of blood in her hairline. A drop trickled down her face, like a nightmarish red tear. She was so pale. There was no pink in her cheeks, and her lips were almost blue. Izuku didn't notice himself get to her side, but suddenly he was there, kneeling beside her. He thought he heard Ryuko and Shino say something, but his ears seemed to be blocking out sound. All his senses were pinpointed on the almost lifeless form of the girl in front of him. He ignored the paramedic's protests as he reached for her hand. Ochako. He squeezed her hands tightly. "She's so cold and pale." Izuku felt a rush of relief almost overtake him as he caught a small flicker of movement across her eyelids. He jumped as a hand lay heavily on his shoulder, and Izuku suddenly remembered the paramedics, and that they had a job to do. His anguished face looked over to them in turn, and Shino gave him a sympathetic but hard smile. "Izuku, I can see this is someone you know, but please, you need to give us some space. You're not in uniform right now, let us help her." And quad. "Is Ochako her name?" Ryuko asked her question gently, but the frown crease on her forehead gave away how worried she was. Izuku nodded wordlessly. "We'll take care of her, Izuku, just give us some space, okay?" Ryuko fitted an oxygen mask over Ochako's nose and mouth, as Izuku stood back up, while Shino moved a red head brace over and fixed it securely to either side of her head, so that she wouldn't be able to agitate any spinal injury she may have. He could barely even bring himself to consider how badly injured she might be, because he was barely holding it together as it was. Shino and Ryuko periodically called her name and explained what was happening as they gave her some pain medication and tried to assess her for any other injuries. Her eyes remained closed. It made him feel sick to see her like that. Izuku's fingers twitched with the desire to join and help them in some way, but both ladies had been paramedics far longer than he had. He had to trust them. Belatedly, he noticed a fluffy coat laid out over Ochako's body and glanced behind him to where the woman in the tracksuit was standing with her dog. She petted the fluffy dog in her arms repeatedly. Izuku cast an agonized look at Ochako, but the two paramedics were taking her blood pressure, so he made his way the short distance to the lady at the edge of the scene. She was tall, with blonde hair tied up at the back except for long wavy bangs that framed her face, and her purple tracksuit was both impeccably clean and bore the golden snake motif of an expensive brand. Large sunglasses sat on top her head, which was strange considering the darkness of the early morning. "Excuse me, but did you see what happened?" Izuku managed to croak out, feeling tears burning in his eyes and closing his throat. Keep it together. He had to believe she was going to be okay, but he needed to know what happened. The lady nodded, her golden eyes full of sympathy. I was walking my darling Izuko, and this girl goes running across the road without looking. She was lucky the van driver saw her last minute and swerved, but it was just at the time she must have noticed him too and jumped out of the way. And quat. She sighed and petted her fluffy dog on the head. Poor girl missed the van but jumped straight onto the ice and fell down hard. I think she hit her head on the curb because she didn't get back up. I didn't know what to do, so I covered her in my coat and called an ambulance. And quat. Izuku felt his heart sink. What was Ochako doing running across the road just after 5 in the morning? "Thank you," he replied sincerely, "you've been a big help." And quat. The lady was about to say something more but caught sight of something behind Izuku that made her shake her head and pull down her sunglasses. When he turned around, he was shocked to see 3 men nearby, flashes coming from their huge cameras. She gave Izuku a thin smile at his puzzled expression. "I like to walk Izuku this early to avoid them, but they always find me somehow. I'd better go and reassure them I've not been involved in any way." And quat. She waved a hand of expensive-looking nails. Maybe they'll spin me into some kind of hero." Her voice wasn't without a note of excitement at the prospect, "but I'll try to make sure that they don't get any more pictures of the poor girl. She can keep the coat." And quat. With that, she put her dog down, gave a look to Ochako as she passed, though with her large sunglasses on it was impossible to tell her expression, and made her way gracefully over to the photographers. "Izuku!" Ryuko yelled. Izuku dashed back to the scene. Shino was trying to hold down Ochako's chest while Ryuko swatted at her swaying hand that was trying to remove the oxygen mask. Ochako's eyes were fluttering open and she was murmuring incoherently into the mask, her breath fogging up the plastic. Her eyes widened when she saw Izuku practically throw himself to his knees beside her, and her murmuring increased in urgency. Shino struggled to keep her lying flat. "I tried putting a dressing on her head and she started waking up, but her concussion is making her confused. You need to stay still for us, Ochako." She added loudly. "We're going to take you to the hospital. You've been in an accident!" And quat. Izuku grabbed hold of the hand that Ochako was using to paw at her mask and gently pulled it away from her face. He could feel his heart breaking at the stricken and panicked expression on her face. Her brown eyes were wide with fear, but unfocused, while blood continued to trickle from her hairline. He placed his hand against her cheek, regardless of the blood. "Ochako, it's okay. You've got a concussion, but you're going to be okay. I promise." And quat. Shino shot him a look, her brown eyes fierce and narrow, and he felt a sharp stab of guilt pierce his gut, even through all of the fear. He knew that they should never, ever promise a patient that, no matter who they were or what circumstances they were in. But the strong, deep voice of his mentor had given him that same promise many years ago, and he'd kept it, so Izuku was going to do the same now. Ochako shook her head in frustration, her eyes drooping closed as she struggled to remain conscious. She reached up to her mask again and Izuku finally pulled it down from her mouth a little, despite the stern looks from both paramedics. Ochako's voice was halting and weak. "I need to tell you about The alarm. And quat. Alarm? He echoed. What alarm? Ochako ? And quat. The alarm. I was supposed to tell you about it. And quat. Izuku tilted his head a little, a frown pinching down the corners of his mouth. She must be very confused. He needed to replace the oxygen mask and get her off to hospital. He reached over, but Ochako's eyes suddenly snapped open and focused brightly on him. Sandwich, she said clearly, for you. In my bag. And quat. She faltered again and her eyelids softly closed. Okay, it's time to go, Ryuko snapped, pulling up the mask while Izuku hesitated. Her bag? A small look around had him finally notice the sports bag on the ground nearby, so he grabbed it. Izuku helped the paramedics wheel Ochako's stretcher into the back of the ambulance and made moves to get into. They weren't leaving him there. Shino gave him a curt nod before she jumped into the driver's seat while Ryuko stayed with him and Ochako in the back. The siren blared out as they pulled away from the accident scene and Izuku squeezed Ochako's hand tightly, while Ryuko applied a clean dressing to the wound on her head, though it had already stopped bleeding. He had to hope that it was just a concussion. The ride to the hospital was blessedly short, though it still felt like too long. Ryuko didn't try to talk to him during the ride, which he was thankful for, because he knew that if he opened his mouth to speak, he would probably just burst into tears. He had to let go of her hand when they entered the hospital and Ochako was transferred onto a hospital bed, but he hovered close by as Shino and Ryuko recounted their patient's injuries and vital information to Katsuki, who was beside her bed checking her over to confirm their diagnosis. Concussion. No obvious fractures. Fell on ice. BP low. And quat. Shino's voice seemed far away. Izuku only half paid attention as he wiped sweat from his forehead, keeping his focus on Ochako, who would look like she was just sleeping peacefully if it wasn't for the dressing on her head, the blood on her cheek and the ghostly pallor to her skin. He glanced down at the drying red blood on the hand he just used to wipe his face, remembering that he'd cradled Ochako's bloody cheek earlier. When he looked back up, Katsuki was glaring at him with a scowl, obviously just noticing his presence and gory appearance. Make yourself fucking useful, Deku, take this. And quat. Katsuki shoved the lady's fluffy coat at him. And get out of my workspace. You're not even in uniform. And quat. Izuku gripped the coat tightly and clenched his teeth. Come on, Izuku, let's get a cup of coffee, Shino said softly, leading him away with a motherly arm around his shoulders. And get you cleaned up, Ryuko added. He ducked under Shino's arm and strode back to Katsuki, who looked up and took a tiny half-step back in surprise. I swear, Kachan, if you don't take care of her because she's my friend, I''LL. And quat. His scowl deepened. You what, Deku ? And quat. Izuku inhaled sharply, but this wasn't the time. His gaze flicked over to Ochako, lying still as the nurses attached N4 to her, and he let the breath go. Shino and Ryuko both grabbed at one of Izuku's arms each, their tight grip leaving no room for escape this time, and he saw Ryuko throw a venomous look over shoulder at Katsuki. As soon as they were sat in the busy, noisy waiting room, Shino went straight to the vending machine to get him a coffee. Ryuko tightened her ponytail. She'll be going for some tests now, she said softly, but I think we can be quietly hopeful, Izuku. The open wound on her head was small. You know how head injuries just like to bleed a lot. It wasn't as bad as it looked. The way she'd fallen makes it look like her shoulder might have taken the impact before her head did. Can't be sure there's no internal fractures until the x-rays come back, but that might have softened the blow. And quat. Shino returned just as Ryuko finished talking, adding her agreement, and handed him a small plastic cup of steaming coffee. Izuku nodded and smiled at them, grateful for both of their support and professionalism. They were great paramedics, which only made the guilt and shame he'd started to feel bubble up more intensely. I didn't smile at her, Izuku said with a pained sigh. The two ladies blinked at him and he continued, staring into his coffee cup. Toshinori used to tell me off for that all the time when I first started my medical training. I would get so caught up in the accident and the treatment and trying my hardest to do the best thing for the patient that I'd forget to smile. And quat. Ryuko laughed. Figures Toshi'd tell you off for something like that. And quat. But he was right. Someone in an accident doesn't want you reciting your medical training under your breath while you help them, or looking like you're going to burst into tears any moment, he added bitterly. They want to know they're going to be okay and that you've got it all under control. He always said that a smile says, don't worry, I'm here and out, boss. Arg, he would have been so disappointed with me just now. Izuku groaned and ran his hands through his messy hair. As soon as Ochako wakes up, I'm going to give her the biggest smile I've got. And quat. That's the spirit, Shino encouraged kindly, honestly Izuku, you're one of the best paramedics I've ever met, you've got bags of potential. You've got such a way with people. You're a good person. I've always thought that was your biggest strength. And quat. You care, Ryuko added with a nod. Their words made Izuku feel a little bit better. Thank you both. Really. From me and from Ochako, thank you for everything. And quat. Just doing our jobs, Ryuko said. Shino stood up, stretched and winked at him. What she means is, you are welcome and apos. But speaking about jobs, we really need to get back to ours. Will you be okay? And quat. Izuku nodded and waved his hands. I'll be fine. Don't worry about me! And quat. Alright, well we hope your girlfriend gets better soon, Izuku. And quat. Shino smiled as she walked away and Ryuko ruffled his hair on her way past. A blush crept into his cheeks as he couldn't quite find the words to deny their assumption. Izuku sipped at his coffee, though it was still a little too hot and kept burning his lips. The typical bustle and noise of the waiting room, even this early in the morning, continued around him while he sat and waited for news of Ochako. He wondered if Katsuki would even come to him when they were finished with the tests. He'd probably just let him sit there all day. Izuku checked his watch, hoping they'd be able to give him some kind of news before his own shift started. Something next to his foot caught his attention, and he realized it was Ochako's bag that he'd picked up and took with them in the ambulance. Shino or Ryuko must have put it there when they'd escorted him to the waiting room. He scrunched his eyebrows together and tilted his head a little as he recalled her saying something about her bag before, when he pulled down her mask. She'd said there was a sandwich for him, hadn't she? Izuku wondered if it would be immoral to look inside, especially since she'd seemed very confused and concussed and probably had no idea what she was saying. But she had looked at him very clearly in that moment. Making a decision and pushing away all of his reticence at looking in Ochako's bag, Izuku pulled the zipper sharply. A glint of foil caught his eye and he lifted out a squishy square shape with the word Izuku written on it in permanent marker pen. Oh, she made me a sandwich. For some reason, that was what finally released the fragile grip he'd got on his emotions, and Izuku felt tears flow fast and hot down both cheeks. He sniffed loudly and rubbed furiously at his face. She had the kindest, biggest heart of anyone he'd ever met and he desperately wanted to know more about her. Anything. Everything. She just had to get better first. No more dancing around his feelings anymore. He was going to ask her on a date. Maybe she would say no, but it was something he was willing to be brave about. Izuku had regained his composure, eaten his sandwich, washed off the blood in the bathroom, and was on his third cup of coffee by the time Katsuki finally reappeared. There wasn't long until his shift started, but he'd already messaged Denki and asked him to bring his spare uniform with him so that he could change without going home, so he was just considering leaving and making his way over to the paramedic hub when his old friend stalked over. Izuku leapt to his feet. What happened? Is she okay? And quat. Of course she's okay, Katsuki snapped. She was under my care, wasn't she? And quat. Izuku's expression darkened. That's why I was asking. And quat. You know what, Deku? Fuck you. I'm sick of you always checking up on my patients. You second guess me all the time and you think I'd purposely not treat someone properly because there's something to do with you? You can't help yourself. You think I'm not a competent doctor, just like he did! And quat. Izuku recoiled. What? And quat. Katsuki gripped his hands tightly by his sides, voice exploding. You walk around the ward double-checking my patients just like Toshinori did. Don't even think about denying it! And quat. I know, Kachan, I don't. I check in on the patients I helped bring to the hospital, because I care about them. Why would you think I'm doing it because I don't think you're a good doctor? And quat. Because you were his favorite, you were always his favorite, but it was supposed to be me. Fuck. Katuski's voice carried loudly through the now silent waiting room. Izuku blinked, too stunned for words. Katuski continued just as loudly, I was the one with perfect grades. I always wanted to be a doctor, it was my dream. You were just little Deku who wanted big things, but would never make it with your mediocre grades and scrawny body. I looked at you and it made me feel better about myself because at least I was going places, at least I would be successful. But then you had your accident, and you kept on telling me you were going to be a paramedic and Toshinori helped you to achieve it. He helped you. He had the best medical mind in the city, and he mentored you. And quat. Izuku nearly choked. Kachan, I nearly died in that accident. Without Toshinori helping me at that crash I would be dead. He was my inspiration, I didn't just decide it on a whim. He used to tell me he saw himself in me because he had a change of career just like I did, because of someone who inspired him too. He could have been a doctor, no problem, but he wanted to be out there helping the people who needed it. Just like I wanted to, like I want to. I'm sorry you see me as a little green rabbit that only exists to feel better about yourself, but that's your problem, not mine, he said. Someone made me realize that Deku was a hero, and I am too. And quat. Katsuki's eyebrows shot up as his red eyes widened. You looked at me and saw something pathetic that would make you feel better, but when I looked at you, I saw something to aspire to. And quat. Izuku shook his head. You were always so brave and confident and smart, Kachan. You've got a temper, and you're terrible with people, but you're one of the best doctors in this hospital. I've always told everyone that you're an amazing doctor. And quat. He took a deep breath. Did you know that Toshinori stuck up for you every time a patient complained about your attitude? And you think he was doubting you? He told me how talented you were, but that he feared you'd end up like the director. He was keeping an eye on you to try and help you. Izuku's fists were balled up in front of him as he spoke, compassion and a desperation to reach Katsuki with this truth filling every word. Finally, doubt filled Katsuki's expression and he stood speechless. What is going on here? The high-pitched croak of the chief nurse snapped both boys back reality. The entire waiting room was staring at them. Izuku felt his ears heat up in shame and even Katsuki looked away with a scoff and folded his arms. Sorry Nurse Shusenji, Izuku said meekly. I come down here because someone tells me there's a ruckus going on in the waiting room, and what do I find? Two of our best members of staff yelling at each other like school children in the playground. And quat. Her tone was stern, and she had the hand that wasn't holding onto her walking stick firmly planted on her hip. Chio Shusenji was a small lady, hunched over and probably well over retirement age. Nobody knew how old she actually was, but she had been chief nurse for a long time in the hospital, and she was to be respected. Nobody argued with her. Not even Katsuki Bakugo. Break it up before the director gets involved, boys. Back to your jobs now, go on. This is a hospital, not a barn, she added more softly, trying to keep amusement out of her voice. She shepherded them away from the waiting room and Katsuki stalked away instantly, while Izuku gave one more glance over to his old friend, watching his back disappear out of the room. Everything about the morning was going so wrong. Izuku changed into Denki's spare uniform as soon as he got to their break room, and recounted the whole experience. When he got to what had happened with Kachan, Denki whistled long and loud. He asked what he should do but his friend just shook his head and refused to comment, then pulled him into a hug. Izuku appreciated it. You'll know what to do, Izu, Denki said with confidence, and Ochako will be okay. I can feel it. Come on bro, let's go save people. I'll even drive for you today again. And quat. Izuku gave him a weak smile and nodded. Thanks. And quat. But you're driving next time, yeah? And quat. They settled into the ambulance and Izuku realized the shaking in his hands had finally stopped. He'd never found out what exactly Ochako's injuries were, but Katsuki had said she was okay. For now, that would have to be enough, but it was going to feel like an agonizingly long shift until he could see her again. At least for now she could rest. He would be back as soon as he could be. Beak. 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 Ochako scrunched her eyes shut tighter. Beak. 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 Why wasn't the alarm switching off? He never usually let it run for this long. Beak. 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 Ochako slowly opened her eyes, wincing at the bright, white light that dazzled her vision. She blinked a few times as her eyes adjusted and felt a strange sense of disconnect from what she saw around her. Thin white bed sheets, a plastic chair beside her bed, and blue curtains drawn shut. This wasn't her room? It smelled strongly of the tang of disinfectant. Her eyebrows drew together as she looked at her surroundings again in disbelief. The last thing she remembered was going to the gym to meet Izuku. Ochako's head tilted against the flat pillow beneath her, her attention shifting to the source of the beeping sound, a screen with different colored lines dancing across it, in time with the beeps. The rhythm of her heartbeat. It was surprisingly steady for someone that had just woken up in a hospital bed, she thought with a dark kind of humor. All things considered. She yelped as she tried to sit up and cringed with a pain that lanced at her from different directions, a dull ache from her head, a sharp sting from her ribs and a throb from her shoulder. She hissed in a breath and with careful movements Ochako managed to prop herself upright, using her pillow as a support for her back. Even though it was kind of flat and lumpy, a tube was connected to the back of her hand, covered over with white tape, and it tugged oddly against her skin when she moved. She shuddered. Now that some sense of awareness had trickled back, Ochako began to recall hazy details from the blank spot in her memory, a dazzling flash of headlights and something that sounded a bit like the screeching of tires. Had she been run over? She turned her palms over and back again, but they looked fine. She flexed her toes and fingers and bent both her knees inside the bed, but it didn't seem like she'd broken anything. She gingerly touched the left side of her ribcage and winced at the pain, though it didn't feel like she'd broken anything, and she couldn't feel any bandages beneath her hospital gown. Her left shoulder was very stiff though, and there was an intense burning sensation that lit up in the joint as she tried to rotate it. Ochako bit her lip to stop from yelping again, but she could still move it, so that was a good sign, right? She carefully reached up and touched her head, feeling the rough texture of stitches beneath her fingertips. Oh, a head injury. That explained her inability to recall what had happened to her, and the headache that was creeping through her skull. She let out a small breath and laid her hand back down beside her. Izuku had probably gone to the gym completely unaware that she'd been going there herself to surprise him. It would have been such a fun moment for them. She'd been so excited to see his expression, and he didn't even get to eat his sandwich. For some reason, that last thought hurt most of all. She was so lame. Unless he'd already heard she was in the hospital from his friends who worked there? She kind of hoped not. She really didn't want him to see her like this. Ochako rubbed her hands over her face, careful to avoid her stitches, and heaved a huge sigh in and out. She really needed to find out what had happened, see if she could get a glass of water, and maybe get a snack for her growling stomach too. Her mom used to say that if she was feeling hungry, that was the best sign that she wasn't too sick. But thinking of her mom tapped into childhood memories of get better kisses and it's okay hugs in a way that made tears sting the backs of her eyes, so she turned her attention to finding a way to sorting out her own problems. Usually there was a little button you could use to call for a nurse or something. She was sure she'd seen that on a television show once. Ochako shifted slightly and frowned at the wires hanging next to her bed, tracing them down with her fingers, and felt her mood brighten as she discovered a small control pad. Those cheesy hospital dramas on television had taught her something at least. A click of what she hoped was the correct button made the bed whereas the back raised up and she could finally lean back more comfortably without having to use the hospital pillow as support, since it didn't offer any anyway. It might not have been the button she was after, but at least she was more comfortable. Doing something positive had improved her mood considerably, and she desperately tried to silence the whispering doubts in the back of her mind, wishing she knew what had happened to her. Fear trickled down her veins and she willed her body to stop shaking. What if she'd got some kind of huge brain injury? What if she'd been asleep for a week or something? She supposed they wouldn't have just left her to wake up naturally in a ward if there was something seriously wrong with her. Would they? It didn't feel like a week later. But then, how would a week later really feel any different? Ochako shook her head slightly to dislodge her spiraling thoughts and brought a hand up to her forehead with a cringe as the action set off a flare of pain in her skull. The curtain surrounding her bed was pulled open slightly as a head poked into the gap and Ochako jumped with a squeak, cringing again at the twinge of pain the motion caused. "Oh, sorry, didn't mean to make you jump," a calm, quiet voice said as a figure walked in and pulled the curtain shut behind himself. He put his hands inside his long white coat as he approached her bed, and Ochako couldn't help her eyes straying to the large red scar across one side of his face. It had obviously been done some time ago, as it was faded and as healed as it would ever get, but it was still a stark contrast to the rest of his pale skin. His hair was white all over, in a fashionably floppy kind of style, with one red streak dyed into it just above the scar, almost as if he wanted emphasis to be drawn to it. Even his eyes were two-tone. One was gray, and one was a piercing aqua blue. "No problem, I'm having a weird kind of day, so I'm probably a little jumpier than usual," she replied with a sad smile. "Yes, I imagine so," he agreed, his voice almost at the tone of being considered flat. "I'm Dr. Todoroki. Izuku is a good friend of mine and he asked me to check in on you while he's on shift. He's got a meeting with the director as soon as he gets back, so it might be a while before he can come to you himself. And quat. So he did know she was here. The thought was both alarming and comforting all at once, but he wanted to come and see her, and that warmed her inside. He'd even asked one of his doctor friends to check in on her. At least now she had time to make herself look more human before he arrived at her bedside. Once she'd had some water, some food, and some painkillers, she'd look and feel much better. Though there wasn't much she could do about the hospital gown, she lamented. That would make it the third time they'd met face to face, and in only one of those meetings had she been wearing normal clothing. She pushed down the sigh that threatened to spill out of her. "Thank you for checking up on me," Ochako finally said, remembering her manners, "but I don't suppose you could tell me what happened to me? And what's wrong with me? And can I get some water?" And maybe a snack, please? I'm not going to die, am I? She added in a panic. Dr. Todoroki smiled crookedly, the corners of his mouth twitching up on his scarred side. I can see why you and Izuku get along so well. You've got his same earnest spirit. And quat. Ochako's blush deepened. His smile faded. I'm not actually your doctor, so I haven't been involved in your care while you've been here. Protocol is that I'm supposed to have you wait for your doctor before your condition is discussed with you, but he's currently in a meeting with the director himself, and I don't think he's going to be in a good mood afterwards, so I'll just tell you what I know anyway, as a favor to Izuku. Your other requests can be easily sorted out for you. And quat. Really? That would be so great. Thank you! And quat. The doctor leaned down and examined her stitches. These are very well done. And quat. He straightened and checked her heart monitor, still beeping away to itself, though he was seemingly satisfied by what he saw because he made a light humming sound of approval. He took a few steps to bottom of the bed and lifted a clipboard, flipped over the sheets, and finally nodded. You've had a mild concussion. Head wounds tend to bleed a lot, so even though your laceration wasn't too deep it still needed stitching, but it's been done up neatly so it looks like it will heal cleanly without much scarring. You've been quite lucky as far as I know. Your shoulder and your ribs took some of the force of your fall so that by the time your head hit the concrete the impact was minimal. And quat. Oh, she squeaked, taking in what she could as he spoke. Your shoulder has been quite badly bruised, as have your ribs, but there's no fractures. The scans on your brain came back negative for any internal bleeds and it doesn't look like there's any other internal damage in that respect. The nurse pushed the trolley closer and Ochako could see a pitcher of water, a cup beside it, and a plate of hot buttered toast and 2 pills. I know I've been asleep already, but I can't wait to get home and make a blanket burrito and just stay there, only emerging for food. Or maybe I'll just take the whole blanket into the kitchen with me, Ochako said wistfully. For some reason waking up in a hospital had started to make her feel embarrassed. She didn't like to be fussed over and couldn't wait to be in her apartment again. That sounds like a good plan. You'll be needing your rest. It looks like you're going to be okay. At least Dr. Todoroki thinks so, and you can trust him. Go. It was odd to see the chief of surgery asking me to bring a patient some water and food, the nurse said curiously, with a sharp sideways glance at Ochako as she fit a wooden tray onto the side of her bed. The chief of? Eh? Ochako burst out. That young doctor had been the chief of surgery? No way. But he was so young! And quat. Yes, he's nepotism personified, you see, the nurse said with a sigh, as she placed the toast and a cup of water on the tray she'd attached to the bed. Ochako tilted her head. It means giving a job to friends or relatives by someone in power, regardless of whether or not they deserve it, the nurse clarified. His father put him in that position as soon as he passed his exams and joined the staff, and the poor boy seemed to do nothing but hate his extremely unusual promotion. And quat. Really? That sounds rough. He did seem a bit. And quat. She didn't quite know how to describe the air of melancholy surrounding the surgeon. But then, why not move hospitals? Ochako took a big bite of her toast, crunching into it gratefully, and gulped down a mouthful of water. Now there's a question. I suspect there's only 3 people in this hospital who know the reason: Izuku, Shadow and his father Enji Todoroki, the director. And quat. Ochako waved her toast in the air. His father's the director of the hospital? You're kidding. This all sounds like a drama on television, you know? Hard to believe this sort of stuff actually happens. And quat. The nurse laughed heartily, hunching over even more. Where do you think they get their inspiration from? Art imitates life, dear. And quat. She leaned heavily on the trolley and Ochako wondered if she was using it to hold herself up. He's a very good surgeon, and this hospital has a high reputation. Maybe he just wants to be in the best place to hone his skills, regardless of who got him there. I think his friendship with Izuku did a lot for his decision to stay here too. And quat. Ochako looked away from the nurse as a familiar bubble of anxiety settled in her gut, the feeling that she should be dissatisfied with what she'd done in her life, even though she enjoyed where she was and the friends it had led her to make. She'd worked hard to earn her degree and she worked hard at the cafe in every shift she had. The way she'd got there didn't matter. What mattered was how she felt about the destination she'd arrived at, and right now she was content with it. The pride she had in her hard work was real and hers, and she shouldn't deny them, even if it was just pouring coffees, serving cake and laughing with Mina. Izuku had inspired that kind of feeling in her, she just had to accept it. She should be looking for the constellations and the fairy lights. Maybe that was what he'd inspired in the surgeon too. The thought of Izuku made her want to see him badly. They're good friends then? she asked as she crunched another bite of toast. He did say he was checking up on me as a favor to Izuku. And quat. Oh, well now, that certainly makes more sense. It's not every day that I get the chief of surgery asking me for small favors like this, but he'd do anything for Izuku. And quat. Yeah, I get the impression he has that kind of effect on lots of people, she whispered. Well, once Todoroki started talking to Izuku, he became much friendlier and seemed to smile a little more. I tell you, that boy can save people even from themselves. And quat. Ochako smiled, even though doubt niggled in her heart. She was happy to know him and happy to call him a friend, so even if he didn't think of her in a special way, she thought he was. He's so kind, she breathed, and generous, like a real-life superhero. But he's also kind of awkward in a cute way and a bit of a geek, and he makes me smile. And quat. Ah, I see, the old nurse croaked warmly with a chuckle. Well, you look after him, dear. He's precious to many people, but he's got a bit of a self-sacrificing nature. He'd do anything to help anyone, even if it hurt himself in some way. You look like you'll be able to keep him in line though. He'll look after himself better if it's to come back to you, I'm sure. And quat. Ochako nearly choked on the painkillers she was trying to swallow. I don't, it's not L like that. He doesn't. And quat. The nurse chuckled again as she put the empty cup and plate back on the trolley, ignoring Ochako's protests. She wheeled them away but looked back as she got to the curtain. You've got color in your cheeks again, that's good. I'll get started with your paperwork so you can go home, and I'll be back soon. And quat. Ochako almost deflated as silence descended once more. Well, this officially took the trophy of the weirdest day she'd ever had, and she didn't think anything would ever beat the day she'd first met Izuku. If the nurse came back too soon though, she wouldn't be able to see Izuku after his meeting. But then she would be able to see him back at the apartment, where she would be showered and in her own clothes. So maybe it was a blessing in disguise. She blinked as she realized she still didn't know exactly how she'd been injured. Had she been hit by a car? There was still a blank spot in her memory after setting off on her jog to the gym. At least she got to go home soon. Ochako, can I come in? Izuku's unmistakable voice was muffled from outside the curtain, making her jump again. She beamed, he'd made it, and replied instantly with a yes. Before she remembered her hospital gown. Ah well, too late to worry about it now. A hesitant Izuku entered through the curtain and shut it again behind him. He stayed far away from her bed, and that puzzled her. She really wanted to jump out of bed and throw her arms around him, but she was still connected to various monitors and she knew it would make her head throb. It's not like she really knew him well enough to do that anyway, she thought sadly, and he seemed to be purposely hanging back for some reason. Izuku, she breathed, full of emotion at seeing a familiar and welcome face at such a scary time. I'm so happy to see you. And quat. She clapped her hands together, resting her fingertips against each other, trying desperately not to cry. He gulped visibly and cleared his throat loudly as he turned away from her. Was he wiping his eyes? But he didn't say anything. Ochako continued in an overly cheerful voice, getting increasingly worried at his distance and strange demeanor. The doctor, the chief of surgery, told me you had a meeting to go to, and that you wouldn't be able to see me for a while. And quat. I do have a meeting. I kind of got in trouble for standing up to that friend I told you about, but ... And quat. Izuku sniffed and took a deep breath. But they can wait. And quat. He finally made his way over to the bed. I was so worried, Ochako. I thought I was going to lose you. I thought ... And quat. Oh, there were tears in his eyes. Izuku sat down in the chair beside her bed and pulled it closer, making it screech loudly on the shiny floor. The sudden absurdity of it made her giggle. He smiled with her and reached slowly to the hand closest to him, taking it in his calloused one. She stopped laughing, surprise widening her eyes, while he averted his green gaze from her, and a blush bloomed behind his freckles. He threaded his fingers through hers as he spoke again in a soft voice, I'm happy to see you too. And quat. His skin was rough, working hands, but they held hers oh so gently. Her heartbeat monitor began to increase the frequency of its beeping, and Ochako felt her face flushing as she realized he would be able to hear the effect he had on her. She gave a couple of strained, high-pitched laughs as she fought with the desire to rip all the tubes and wires off. Izuku noticed her distress and subtly reached up to press some buttons on it until it muted, even though she could still see the lines dancing across the screen. She twined her fingers with his firmly, as a thank you, and bit her lip, feeling her heart race even faster. How, his voice broke slightly, and he cleared his throat. How are you feeling? And quat. I'm fine really. Except the headache. And the pain in my shoulders. And my ribs. But, not dead or in a coma, and I've got all my limbs, so I can't really complain. It sounded like she was trying too hard to be cheerful, even to her own ears. Izuku frowned, concern shining in his eyes. I could suggest you stay in the hospital longer ? And quat. Oh no. I'm alright, honestly. The worst thing is the embarrassment that not only have you seen me in my old pajamas, but now here I am in a fashionable hospital gown too. She sighed overdramatically with a shrug, trying to play it off as humor. Izuku reached up with his other hand, almost as if he was going to touch her cheek, but he left it suspended in the air between them and then let it fall back down slowly. He finally smiled and something tight relaxed in her chest at the sight, like he was making everything better just by being there. His voice was soft and almost lost in a breath as he said, "And you've looked pretty every time. And quat." Ochako's heart thumped in her chest, making her intensely grateful that he was no longer able to hear her heartbeat out loud. "But I still haven't seen you in your uniform yet," he added playfully, the redness in his cheeks extending over his nose and the tips of ears. A laugh hissed out from her lips. "No, I'll die of embarrassment. Just the thought might make me stay here forever!" And quat. His grip tightened, and pain flashed over his face. "I did?" She squeaked as her whole body went rigid, the color draining from her face. "Did I say why? And quat. "No, you just said you needed to tell me about it, and then you told me you'd made me a sandwich. And quat." "Wow," she laughed a little too loudly, but Izuku didn't seem to notice. "Sure do say some weird things when you're concussed! And quat. The alarm didn't make any sense, but since you told me there was a sandwich for me in your bag, I really hope you don't mind that I looked for it, because it was so good. And quat. Ochako pushed away the weird sense of relief she had that she hadn't revealed that their friendship had begun as being built on a lie, but her face lit up at him, liking her lunch she made him. It was only a simple sandwich, he was too nice. She finally laid her legs flat in the bed again and removed her hands from her face, folding them in her lap. No, I'm glad you looked for it. I was kind of upset when I woke up and thought you wouldn't be able to try it. How silly is that? And quat. Well, I wasn't going to eat it at first because I couldn't bring myself to do it. I thought if I ate the last thing you'd made it might jinx you or something. That's silly. But Denki told me if I didn't eat it, he would. And quat. She laughed. "No, I'm so happy you enjoyed it. It fulfilled its delicious lunch purpose," she added dramatically with a wave of her hands. She loved it when Izuku smiled. Everything just felt warmer and better somehow. She only wished she had the courage to ask if they could be more than friends, but there was still the tiniest trickle of doubt in the back of her mind that he was just a very kind person and didn't consider her differently than he did everyone else he was friendly with. But he'd held her hand, hadn't he? And he continued to persist in being in her life, even after all the bizarre situations he'd seen her in, and despite her inability to flirt successfully. Sometimes, she even thought that maybe he was flirting with her. Deciding that she could blame her actions on her lingering concussion if she had to, Ochako reached out a hand to gently hold his again. Her heart fluttered in her chest as she gripped it tightly. His green eyes were full of emotion when she glanced up and gave him a shy, hesitant smile, but then he cleared his throat and looked away. "Ochako, now that you're awake, I really wanted to ask you something. Would you like to go on a date?" And quat. He stopped and looked away. He was quiet for long enough that Ochako felt the need to fill the odd silence he'd left. "Dr. Todoroki told me I'm okay to go home soon, and the nurse is getting everything ready so I can go. And quat. Oh yeah. And quat. He perked up at the change of subject. "Shadow said he talked to you. I wish I could take you home myself, but I've still got the rest of my shift left. But I'll ring a taxi for you. I'll pay. And quat. That's okay, really, I can get the bus, it won't be too expensive. They're pretty regular from this part of the city. And what? And quat. "Ochako, you've had a mild concussion. You've been in hospital all morning. You can't catch a bus home. As a medical professional, I can't let you do that. Let me order you a taxi, please. And quat. Ochako shivered at the intensity of his gaze and the emotion in his voice. "Okay, but I really do feel fine. And quat. Izuku visibly relaxed, but his hand remained entwined with hers. "You do look much better than when I saw you lying on the ground. Until I saw your eyelids moving, I thought you were." And quat. Ochako snatched her hand away from his, and only briefly registered his wide eyes, before she hid her face behind her palms and pulled up her knees, so she could rest her forehead on them, hiding further. "No, she groaned into her hands, ignoring the burning from her ribs and shoulder and the throbbing in her head. "What? Ochako, are you okay? And quat. I can't believe you've seen me unconscious on the floor too, she moaned. She was such a mess. Don't be embarrassed. You'd had an accident. You were unconscious just lying there. And I was just panicking. I was so useless. I didn't really do anything. I just froze at the sight of you. Some paramedic I was. And it really doesn't matter what you looked like, he rambled, as he waved his hands in a fluster. I was just so happy you weren't. Gods, you were so pale, and I was so scared you were. Anyway, now that you're awake again and okay, I can relax. And quat. He sounded so sad. She peeked at him from between her fingers. Really? And quat. She hadn't seen him look that vulnerable and raw before. Izuku nodded, a smile pinching up his cheeks, tears shining in his eyes. His voice regained some of its usual cheer as he said, besides, you did wake up for a minute or two. And quat. I did? And quat. Yeah, you mentioned something about you needing to tell me about an alarm? And quat. I did? She squeaked as her whole body went rigid, the color draining from her face. Did I say why? And quat. No, you just said you needed to tell me about it, and then you told me you'd made me a sandwich. And quat. Wow, she laughed a little too loudly, but Izuku didn't seem to notice. Sure do say some weird things when you're concussed! And quat. The alarm didn't make any sense, but since you told me there was a sandwich for me in your bag, I really hope you don't mind that I looked for it, because it was so good. And quat. Ochako pushed away the weird sense of relief she had that she hadn't revealed that their friendship had begun as being built on a lie, but her face lit up at him liking her lunch she made him. It was only a simple sandwich, he was too nice. She finally laid her legs flat in the bed again and removed her hands from her face, folding them in her lap. No, I'm glad you looked for it. I was kind of upset when I woke up and thought you wouldn't be able to try it. How silly is that? And quat. Well, I wasn't going to eat it at first because I couldn't bring myself to do it. I thought if I ate the last thing you'd made it might jinx you or something. That's silly. But Denki told me if I didn't eat it, he would. And quat. She laughed. No, I'm so happy you enjoyed it. It fulfilled its delicious lunch purpose, she added dramatically with a wave of her hands. She loved it when Izuku smiled. Everything just felt warmer and better somehow. She only wished she had the courage to ask if they could be more than friends, but there was still the tiniest trickle of doubt in the back of her mind that he was just a very kind person and didn't consider her differently than he did everyone else he was friendly with. But he'd held her hand, hadn't he? And he continued to persist in being in her life, even after all the bizarre situations he'd seen her in, and despite her inability to flirt successfully. Sometimes, she even thought that maybe he was flirting with her. Deciding that she could blame her actions on her lingering concussion if she had to, Ochako reached out a hand to gently hold his again. Her heart fluttered in her chest as she gripped it tightly. His green eyes were full of emotion when she glanced up and gave him a shy, hesitant smile, but then he cleared his throat and looked away. Ochako, now that you're awake, I really wanted to ask you something. Would you like to go on a and quat? The curtain at the foot of her bed was suddenly ripped aside. The metal rings screeched in protest on the curtain pole, and both Ochako and Izuku jumped, his hand pulling out of hers instantly as he leapt up from the chair. A girl with pink messy hair launched herself at her bedside. Ocha! And quat. And Mina? And quat. Us too, Sue croaked as she calmly entered behind Mina. Oh, Chako, are you okay? Momo moved to her other side and stroked her hair carefully. How are you? Kyoka's usually stoic expression was full of concern. Her group of friends amassed themselves around her, looking at her with worried faces. They were all in their work clothes. Shouldn't they be working? She was about to respond when she noticed Sue tilt her head and place a finger to her chin, looking at Izuku, who had naturally taken a few paces back when the girls had entered. Sorry, she said in her uniquely croaky voice, we didn't know Ochako already had a visitor. And quat. The other girls turned to look at him and Mina shot a look back at Ochako, her eyebrows wiggling above her eyes. Ochako felt heat rising up her neck while Izuku looked terribly uncomfortable. Hi, I'm Izuku, I'm a friend of Ochako's from her building. And quat. He looked down at his uniform. Oh, I'm also a paramedic that works in the hospital. I bumped into Ochako one day in the corridor of our building. I also jog to the gym every day, including this morning when I saw her on my way to the gym because she'd had an accident, but I guess you know that already, and since I work here and she's also my friend, I thought I'd visit her between jobs, he mumbled rapidly, completely losing the others who couldn't keep up with disjointed storytelling. I should be going anyway. I have a meeting I should have been at a while ago. I'll see you at the apartment building later, Ochako. And Quat. His gaze softened. I'll come round after my shift, okay? I'll be able to finish my question then. I'm glad you're feeling better. Bye ladies, he added awkwardly as he swiftly made his exit. I'll be there, she promised, even though he'd already gone. All eyes returned to her. Ochako waved her hands wildly in front of her flushed face. It's not what you think! And Quat. Oh? What do we think, Ochako? You've been hiding a boyfriend from us? That's the paramedic who helped me at the school the other day, you know. I can't believe it. And Quat. Momo clasped her hands to her chest. You fell in love and you didn't tell us? And Quat. No, nothing like that. Ochako protested, though it was weak and she knew it. She had fallen in love with him. It's okay if you don't want to tell us about him, but Mina will probably tell us all later anyway, Sue pointed out, tilting her head towards the girl who was grinning so widely and so desperate to talk that she was nearly vibrating on the spot. Mina burst out, unable to contain her excitement any longer. Ocha, I can't believe you too. He looks at you like you're his world. That's so cute. She fanned her face with her hands. He does? And no, you can't have been looking properly. He just thinks we're friends, Ochako said, though hope sang through her veins. Did he? Her friends exchanged bemused expressions. Sue even shook her head with a smile. So how come you know about this mystery man, Mina? Kyoko rested a hand on her hip. It's a long story, Mina replied diplomatically with a shrug. I'll tell you all about it in the car, she couldn't help but add. Ochako sighed heavily, but she was smiling. She loved her friends so much. But wait, what are you all doing here anyway? How did you know I was here? And Quat. How? Kyoko echoed. Yeah. And Quat. Ochako looked around at them, confusion making her voice high. I only had my accident this morning and My accident? I still don't know what happened to me. I keep forgetting to ask. And Quat. She rubbed her forehead, careful of her stitches. Why we're here, and what happened to you? You mean you don't know? Momo looked at her sadly, and it made her skin crawl with dread. I'm not sure I like where this is going. Did Izuku get in touch with you? And Quat. Mina shook her head, making her pink hair bounce cutely, and passed over her phone. She had one of those pretty phone cases that was filled with a sparkly gel, and it always made Ochako feel self-conscious of her old scuffed phone. With a sinking feeling she looked down at the page Mina had left it on. She gasped in horror. No. I can't believe this. She wailed, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles went white. There was an article on the screen with the title of Supermodel Saves Girl in huge text above two photos, one of a lady with golden eyes holding onto a fluffy dog, and one that was a slightly blurry picture of herself lying unconscious on the ground with a coat over her. There were two female paramedics beside her and Izuku. It was hard to see his expression on the dark photo, but he was there, holding her hand. She scrolled down, but she couldn't bring herself to read the text. Mina sent us this article as soon as she saw it this morning, and we all came as quickly as we could. People are kind and offered to cover us at work while we were gone, Sue said warmly, even though her eyes looked teary. I hated seeing you like that, Ochako, just from a photo. It must have been very hard for your paramedic friend being there. And Quat. Ochako bit her lip, feeling a tug of sadness in her gut. She was torn between feeling mortified that she was on the internet, and probably the papers tomorrow, lying on the floor like a loser, and sad that Izuku had seen her like that in person. She could only imagine how she would feel if their roles were reversed. That must have been so horrible for him. It says you nearly got ran over, Ocha. Mina explained as she took back her phone gently. The grape juice truck. And Quat. Grape juice truck? And Quat. Just missed you, but then you slipped on the ice. And Quat. I slipped? And Quat. And fell and hit your head. And Quat. Ochako wanted to curl up under the covers and never emerge into society again. That was the worst story of how someone ended up in hospital ever, and it was on the public domain. She could only pray that nobody else knew it was her in the article, since it thankfully didn't include her name. Momo laid a hand on Ochako's shoulder softly in a motherly gesture. You're lucky that Uwabami found you while she was walking her dog. She's the one that called the ambulance. It was just an unfortunate accident, honey. It couldn't be helped. Don't worry. And Quat. We're just glad you're okay, Sue added with a wide smile. Ochako looked around at her best friends while warmth bloomed in her chest, and returned Sue's smile, hoping they could hear the sincerity in her voice when she replied thickly, Thanks everyone. And Quat. There was a small pause before she spoke again, scratching the side of her cheek. Just a question though, who's Uwabami and quat? The friends all dissolved into laughter and Ochako soon joined in, wondering why such a simple question had brought such good humor to them all. She guessed it was just a release of tension. Worry, concern and fear for her had clearly affected them all, and now they knew she was okay. They were able to release all those emotions that had been built up. She remembered seeing a crease above Izuku's nose for most of their time together, where his eyebrows were pushing together. He'd still seemed tense, and she wondered if that would go away if he saw her in her own apartment looking well in her own clothes. She wondered how many times Izuku had been at a patient's bedside wondering if he would ever see them awake again. It must have been scary for him. Uwabami is only one of the most famous actress-turned-supermodels there is. Ocha, you been living under a rock? Mina managed through her subsiding giggles. She's got one of those cool stage names that's just one word and quat. And nobody knows her real name, Kyoka added, with an air of admiration. The article said she's gifted you her code for being a brave fan of hers. Isn't that kind of her? Sue's eyes twinkled mischievously. Really? Ochako blinked. I don't know if I'd want to keep a reminder of this actually and quat. I'll have it if you don't want it. Mina gasped. They all laughed again and Ochako felt her cheeks hurt with how much she'd been smiling. Her friends were the perfect medicine to feel better. Here's your paperwork, dear, all ready for what's going on here? The unmistakable croak of the old nurse from before exclaimed in horror as she emerged from the other side of the curtain to see three girls surrounding Ochako's bed. How did you girls get in here? Out. Come on now and quat. She made shooing motions with the hand not holding her up with a walking stick. Yeah, we kind of dodged past the reception, Mina admitted to Ochako as she was herded out by the small old nurse. I drove us here, and we're going to take you home too, Ochako, so meet us at the entrance. Momo threw over her shoulder as they left. She could hear the others giggling as they went. The nurse huffed as silence and order descended once more, but when she turned around Ochako could see the good-natured smile on her wrinkled face. That was more excitement than a recovering patient needs just after she woke up. She reprimanded gently, but they look like a good group of friends and quat. They really are. I'm super lucky and quat. The nurse placed a bundle of clothes, with a few pieces of paper on top, on the chair beside the bed. Here's everything you need. Be sure to stop by the desk on your way out, and in the nicest possible way I hope we don't see each other again, dear. Be careful and look after yourself. Oh, and here, have a candy and quat. Ochako's hand was pulled up and a small candy block was deposited in it from one of those odd little plastic dispensers. Thank you for everything, Ochako chirped, popping the candy into her mouth. It was sweet peach, one of her favorite flavors. Oh, wait. Could you please take a message to Izuku? He said he was going to phone for a taxi to take me home, but my friends are going to take me instead. Could you tell him for me? I don't want him to spend money unnecessarily, and I don't want him to worry. And could you please tell him? That I'll be waiting for him after his shift, so please come see me. She grinned, her cheeks pink. The nurse shook her head and muttered something that sounded like kids but gave Ochako one last wrinkly smile as she said, Of course I'll tell him. Now you go home and get some rest and quat. Thank you, I will and quat. Alone once more Ochako heaved a huge breath in and out before swinging her legs over the side of the bed, ready to get dressed and go. She was sick of all the weaknesses inside herself. It was time to replace them with strengths. She danced around thinking Izuku had feelings for her then thinking he didn't, and she wasn't going to let it stop her anymore. She was sure he had been going to ask her on a date when he'd been interrupted and she wasn't going to let her own doubt talk herself out of it, whether he had feelings for her or not, or whether he was going to ask her out on a date or not. She only had one life and she intended on living it. No more dreams and stars that she couldn't reach that only served to make herself unhappy. She was already living among them. She was going to stand on her own 2 feet, proud of what she'd achieved and happy to see what else she could do without judging herself by other people's standards. When he came to visit her later she'd be the one to ask him on a date. And she was going to confess to him about his alarm. Thanks for making it to the end, and for sticking around with me through my absence. You're awesome. I can't thank you enough. But I'll still try. Thank you. Subscribe so you don't miss the next part.